Immune memory. In encountering a pathogen, the immune system of an individual who has been vaccinated against that specific pathogen is able to more rapidly and more robustly mount a protective immune response. Immune memory has been shown to be sufficient for protection against pathogens when the incubation period is long enough for a new immune response to develop. For example, in the case of HPV, which has an incubation period of 6 weeks to 6 months, and a vaccinated individual is usually protected following vaccination, even if exposure to virus occurs sometimes after vaccination and the level of vaccine-induced antibody have already warmed. Here we find the vaccine antigen exposure and the antibody titer on the y-axis, the primary immune response, and this is the secondary immune response. Exposure to pathogen, long incubation period, for example hepatitis B virus, antibody level above protective threshold. This is because the memory cells, and here the protective antibody level. The memory response may be sufficient to protect against disease if there is a long incubation period between pathogen exposure and the onset of symptoms to allow for the 3 to 4 days required for memory B cells to generate antibody titer above the protective threshold. Conversely, it's so that immune memory may not be sufficient for protective against rapidly invasive bacterial infection that can cause severe disease within hours or days following acquisition of the pathogen. Here, short incubation period. For example, Haemophilus influenzae type B, insufficient time to raise protective antibody level. Here the primary immune response, here is the secondary immune response. Exposure to pathogen. The memory response may not be sufficient to protect against disease if a pathogen has a short incubation period and there is rapid onset of symptoms before antibody level have reached the protective threshold. For example, there is evidence in the case of both Haemophilus influenzae type B and capsular group C meningococcal infection that individuals with vaccine-induced immune memory can still develop disease once their antibody level have waned, despite mounting robust, although not rapid enough, memory response. The waning of antibody level varies depending on the age of the vaccine recipient, being very rapid in infant as a result of the lack of bone marrow for B cell survival, the nature of the antigen, and the number of booster doses administered. For example, the virus-like particles used in HPV vaccine induce antibody responses that can persist for decades, whereas relatively short-term antibody responses are induced by pertussis vaccine, and the inactivated measles vaccine induces short-lived antibody response than the live attenuated measles vaccine. So, for infections that are manifest soon after acquisition of the pathogen, the memory response may be insufficient to control this infection, and sustained immunity for individual protection through vaccination can be difficult to achieve. One solution to this is the provision of booster doses of vaccine through childhood, as is the case, for example, for diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and polio vaccine, in an attempt to sustain antibody level above the protective threshold. It's known that provision of 5 or 6 doses of tetanus or diphtheria vaccine in childhood provide lifelong protection, and so booster doses of these vaccines throughout adult life are not routine in most countries that can achieve high coverage with multiple childhood doses. Give that for some infection, The main burden is in young children. Continued boosting after the second year of life is not undertaken. For example, the invasive bacterial infection including HIV and capsular group B meningococcal, the exception in the pertussis vaccine, where the focus of vaccine program is the prevention of disease in infancy. This is achieved both by direct vaccination of infant as well as by the vaccination of other age groups, including adolescents and pregnant women in some programs. To reduce transmission to infant and provide protection by antibody transfer across the placenta, notably in high-income cities, many countries, starting in 1990, have switched to using the acellular pertussis vaccine, which is less reactogenic than, therefore was thought to be preferable to the older whole cell pertussis vaccine that is still used in most low-income countries. It's now apparent that acellular pertussis vaccine induces a shorter duration of protection against clinical pertussis and may be less effective against bacterial transmission than in the whole cell pertussis vaccine. Many high-income countries have observed a rise in pertussis cases since the introduction of acellular vaccine, a phenomenon that is not observed in low-income nations using the whole cell vaccine. By contrast, lifelong protection seems to be the rule following a single dose with some of the live-attenuated viral vaccines, such as yellow fever vaccine. Also, it's apparent that protection is incomplete with others. The primary response, vaccine antigen exposure, the data here, we find the antibody titer here, the vaccine antigen exposure, the protective antibody level. In some cases, antibody level after primary vaccination remain above the protective threshold and can provide lifelong immunity. In the case of varicella zoster and measles mumps vaccine, some breakthrough cases are described during disease outbreak among those individuals who have previously been vaccinated, although it's unclear whether this represents a group in whom immunity has waned or who therefore needed booster vaccination, or a group for whom the initial vaccine didn't induce a successful immune response. Breakthrough cases are less likely in those individuals who have had 2 doses of measles, mumps, rubella vaccine or varicella zoster vaccine, and cases that do occur are usually mild, which indicate that there is some lasting immunity to the pathogen. An illustration of the complexity of immune memory and the importance of understanding its underlying immunological mechanisms in order to improve vaccination strategies is provided by the concept of original antigenic sin. This phenomenon describes how the immune system failed to generate an immune response against a strain of a pathogen. If the host was previously exposed to a closely related strain, and this has been demonstrated in several infections, including dengue and influenza, this might have important implication for vaccine development. Only a single pathogen strain or a pathogen antigen is induced in a vaccine, as vaccine recipient might then have impaired immune response if later exposed to different strains of the same pathogen, potentially putting them in increased risk of infection or more severe diseases. Strategies to overcome this include the use of adjuvant that stimulate immune responses, which can include sufficient cross-reactive B cells and T cells that recognize different strains of some pathogen, or the inclusion of as many strains in your vaccine as possible. The later approach obviously being limited by the potential of new strain to emerge in the future.